something you learned? Were you born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity.
Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Inshira Adam. Hello and welcome to the Executive Lounge, the show that brings you nuggets of insights from the lives and work of men and women who've scaled the daunting heights of either starting their own business or running institutions and just basically changing the world. My guest today is a lecturer at Ashesi University. She's a PhD in mechanical engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's easier to say MIT. But what's remarkable about her work is her approach to practicalizing education. And my guest will be sharing that with us today. Welcome to the Executive Lounge, Heather Beem.
Thank you so much.
It's quite impressive that you'd finish school and then decide that for the last 5 years you're going to stay in Ghana. Well, coming up 5 years now. But more importantly, it's what you're doing that strikes me as brilliant. What inspired the Practical Education Network?
So I grew up in the US in a state which is average to low performing when it comes to education. In fact, my state usually ranks near the bottom 3 or 4 states. And so as I was growing up, even though I wasn't studying education or thinking specifically about it, it was sort of in the back of my mind. And both of my parents have also been teachers at some point in their lives. So there was always this sort of narrative in the background about education, how could it be better than what me and my siblings were experiencing? And while I was growing up, I also had the opportunity to travel to a couple of different countries and go to school in those places, in Taiwan, where my mom is from, and then also in Germany for a short period of time. So again, although I wasn't studying education, there was this thought constantly in the back of my mind, what could education look like? What should it look like? What does that really mean for the student? So this was in the back of my mind. And then when I went to MIT, I was very fortunate to get to go there as a graduate student in mechanical engineering. And while I was there, my mind was sort of blown away by the practicality and the way in which that was emphasized throughout the experience for the student. In class, outside of class, in the hallway, there are projects going on, students are engaged in real hands-on experiences. And so that started to get me thinking, this seems like a good solution to that question, which has been in my mind for a long time. And if this is a solution, can we share it with people beyond the walls of this institution that only a few thousand people, get to go to? So I started looking for ways that I could share a little piece of what I was getting to experience at MIT with students in other contexts. And I was excited to see if we could do that in an environment where it seems particularly challenging. If we were to find a group of students in a place where materials are very limited, is it still possible to produce this kind of hands-on experience for students? And eventually I got connected to some folks in Ghana, and that kind of started my journey here.
Wow, that's interesting. So you had this innate or curiosity about what more could be of the education you were getting. But how is it that you were able to keep this for so long till you arrived at MIT? What kept your interest and your questioning going?
Yeah, so as I said, it wasn't an explicit line of questioning. It was just in the back of my mind, in the background, kind of ongoing. As I went to Taiwan, as I went to Germany, the sort of questions would sort of surface in my mind, but I actually didn't really pay that much attention to them because I was focused on engineering.
That's right.
But it just happened that in each of these new settings I found myself, that would sort of creep back up in my mind.
What would you say were the marked differences in the way school was taught from your home state to the experiences you had in Taiwan and in Germany?
Well, each of them was a bit different. I think priorities were different in each place. Not necessarily that the execution was that different, but I think in Taiwan, for example, math and science are really prioritized. And so, you know, that sort of comes at the students who excel in those things are seen to be like premier students. So the priorities were quite different there. And then, let's see, in Germany, there was a lot of independence to the learning. You were expected to be able to just take a little bit of information from what the lecturer was giving you and then build out a whole set of knowledge around that. So, yeah, it just sort of revealed to me, you know, different priorities, different angles at which you could.
What did you find when you arrived in Ghana?
Yeah, so when I see Ghanaian students, I see a bit of myself in them. I feel like they have so much potential, but a lot of the factors that are in the environment for them are working against their ability to succeed. I think some of these factors include overemphasis on memorization. So there's a huge amount of material that people feel like has to be covered, and so it seems like the best way to get through it is just force and cram and memorize as much as you can. And that's really a detriment to unlocking the students' potentials.
Okay. So it's quite interesting. I watched a YouTube video of a TED Talk that you delivered. And especially when you did a demonstration on how gases are released in an acid and base reaction. It was mind-blowing. It was so simple yet profound. And I look back at my own time doing science in school, and I'm thinking, this would stick with me forever. Why do you feel that there's a tendency to push more of the rote learning and more of the text as compared to the practicalization of that same text, which would be more relatable to people?
Well, there are probably different factors leading to why that's the case now. Some of it is colonial remnants. I think also another part of it is not knowing how to make it practical. So if you haven't seen a different way of doing it before, it's hard to imagine that that's also a possibility out there. So I think people do what they're used to, what they've seen, and until they themselves experience a different way, it's hard to just create that from scratch.
That's right. It's often said that children are the future, which indeed is true because we expect children to live on and carry on traditions and carry on the frontier of development and innovation. But if we would compare the practical approach to learning science to the theorized version, one would always say that the practical approach will yield more because it frees up the potential within the children. How important will that be for a continent that soon will have more people on it, young people especially, than any other in the world?
Yeah, the population is growing rapidly. It's not really an option. We have to seriously look at how we can best equip youth for the evolving future. And so, yeah, to me, this is paramount concern for societal growth. Unlocking the students' ability to think and act independently and creatively.
So, for a model like the Practical Education Network, first of all, help our audience understand what the Practical Education Network is all about.
Yeah, Practical Education Network, or PEN for short, is an NGO I started with exactly this vision I just described of sharing this hands-on style of teaching and learning that I experienced at MIT with students everywhere. We've been doing this in Ghana for about 4 years now, trained about 3,000 teachers in this approach, And the essence of it is really to help teachers have the skills and ideas to do practical activities on a regular basis, regardless of what materials they do or don't have in their school. Right now, the focus is on materials. I need this test tube, I need this piece of equipment. But at MIT, yes, there were materials and there were equipment, but that wasn't the focus. The focus was on creating. And so you look around, and whatever is available, you use it to create a project. And so we're trying to instill that ethos into the teachers here, to not feel like they're in lack or they're limited, but they have things around. They have bottles, they have straws, they have balloons. All of these things can be creatively repurposed into practical teaching tools.
What's been the response like? I mean, how many times do you go to places and people have aha moments where they thought, so all of these things that we used to think were junk could actually facilitate?
It happens every single time we do a training. Every single time we do a training.
Wow.
And we've done that dozens and dozens of times. And we've even measured it. So we ask before the workshop and at the end of just a one-day workshop, you know, how feasible is it for you to do practicals in your classroom? And just within the span of hours, we measure a statistically significant increase in their perception of what's possible. Because they never before thought these things that seem like useless items can actually be helpful to me.
Okay, so quite a lot has been said about you know, science, technology, engineering, and math leading the way. Recently, in a conversation with someone, they also said that they think there's an element in there that needs to be incorporated, and they said, well, instead of STEM, they were thinking of STEAM, where there's a bit more art, you know, that the touchy-feely stuff around us need to be incorporated in all of this. I noticed that you were nodding when I mentioned STEAM. What's your take on that, and how can a country like Ghana embrace the dividends that a process like that could deliver?
Yeah, I think the art piece makes sense because, for example, what we're trying to get the science teachers to do is to design, you know, design new teaching tools that may or may not exist. And to do that, there's some creative aspect to it. And so having an artistic angle could help, which is different from the scientific method, which is this linear, you know, you make your hypothesis, you set up the experiments. And if you're able to bring in sort of more of an art angle, it would help with that creative aspect. So, for example, if we have an activity that we share with teachers in our resource, but they don't have that particular, they can't find a balloon, for example, in their community because it's not Christmas time or something like that, you know, they need to have a creative muscle to be able to think of what else could I use in that case. And I think that if there was some art, design, sort of training to the whole thing, then it could help them with that skill.
Are you familiar with the Ghanaian curriculum?
Yes.
Okay. How much emphasis do you think needs to be put on arts teaching?
I don't know if I can quantify that, but I think it's important. But I also would say that the way it's taught is also really important. You know, if we're teaching art, but we're saying, okay, here's a sketch, now fill it in, you know, color in the existing sketch for me. If that style of teaching art is the main mode, it's not really unlocking the potential of the student again to practice their creative energy. So I think art is important, but I wouldn't say let's just push more art. Let's also think critically about how we're teaching it.
You know. So your time at MIT saw you getting quite interested in what was called the D Lab.
Yeah.
What drew you into that space?
Okay, so MIT can be a tough place. It's a rigorous place, and it's really cold in the winter over there. So in the course of the PhD, you have to do what's called a qualifying exam, where you have to pass this set of written questions and oral questions before they allow you to continue towards a PhD. So I had to do that twice. I failed the first time, went at it again the second time, and thankfully passed the second time. But at that point, I told myself, okay, if I'm really going to go for this PhD thing, let me make the most of my time here at MIT. Let me not just work in my lab and then at the end of the years, all I can say is I've done something in this lab. MIT has so many different things going on. So at that point, I took a look at the whole ecosystem at MIT and said, which other program is there that I could be involved in and do something interesting with my skills? And I found myself gravitating towards this program called D-Lab, which was set up about a little over 10 years ago now, with the goal of equipping students to be able to work meaningfully with rural communities in the developing worlds. And I'd never thought of that as a potential line of work for me, but they were teaching engineering students to do that kind of work. And so it wasn't just, providing mosquito nets or something, it was engaging the community in engineering processes and building, innovative water filters or anything like that. And so I found myself really interested in seeing if I could apply whatever skills I had as an engineer to what felt like real problems.
That's an interesting space to be in, and that led to you co-founding D-Lab Education. What's D-Lab Education?
Okay, so D-Lab had about a handful of classes, maybe half a dozen classes at that time, focused on health, sanitation, energy. And right after I passed my qualifying exams, I had made some connections with schools in Ghana. This idea that I mentioned earlier was building up in my head. How can I share this stuff with other students? So I made a trip to Takoradi. That was in 2011. And then when I came back, I felt like, wow, there's so much work to be done to improve education globally. And if MIT is serious about trying to make a meaningful impact in the world, education should be part of the agenda. MIT doesn't have an education department. You can't study education at MIT, but I felt like, this is something that clearly should exist, and other people around me also seem to agree. So I and a few other people pushed and got, some teaching staff together, and we approached D-Lab and suggested that we offer an education-specific class for students to learn.
And this was accepted.
This was accepted, yeah.
How difficult was it to get it done?
It was a bit difficult because we were students. I was a graduate student, there were some undergraduate students, and we were trying to make the case that, we should be teaching about education. And so none of us had education qualifications, but felt passionately that this is something that should be done. So it was a bit difficult because we were trying to tell people who have these lengthy list of CV items with education, and they kept telling us like, oh, you don't really know how this works. But thankfully, D-Lab the director was open to it, and so she sort of took it on as an experiment, and it's still going to this day. So.
Wow, that's fantastic news. I mean, it's quite interesting. Just before we take this break, I'd like to, what about the environment empowers you, a student, to say, this institution that predates my parents and maybe my grandparents should think about something that I am proposing and adopt it and actually carry it out. How did that environment make you feel that you could take your ideas and pitch it to someone?
Yeah, I don't know how to really hone in on exactly what it is, but it did create that sense in me, that sense of urgency to do what's important, and also gave me the courage to try. I think, I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's just that everybody in the institution is trying things, is sort of experimenting and trying new projects, new programs. And so it didn't seem out of the norm, I guess, to try something new.
So there's, would you say that there's a better tolerance of the input that a millennial would make in an institution that's been around a few centuries?
As compared to a new institution?
Yeah.
Maybe. I think, I don't know that it has so much to do with the age as opposed to the culture within the institution. I think a young institution could certainly take on a millennial's ideas too, just depending on the culture that's considered the normal mode there.
I like the mention of the word culture. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll explore the culture that is required to ensure that we're educating people who will be ready for what is being called the future of work. This is the Executive Lounge. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with some more. Welcome back to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshirado, and my guest, Heather Beem. She has a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT and currently teaches at Ashesi University, as well as run the NGO PEN, which means Practical Education Network, where they hope to teach more teachers how to make the learning and teaching of science practical. That's great. I like it. And, just before we went, I talked about, wanting to explore the concept of culture. So you mentioned that the culture at MIT was able to harness your own curiosity and desire and vision to see something else done, very progressive. Old school belief is that, you have these high and mighty professors who make education a monologue. How do we turn that around for whether it's a culture in a workplace or the culture in an educational institution? What do you think ought to be done? Maybe a value shift that would allow more and more people to be able to feel compelled to contribute positively to where the vision is going and what it represents.
Wow. Well, one idea would maybe be to challenge the teachers or the leaders to have the students create some of the things that they're working towards, whether that's in their class, in their labs, maybe if they have a set of labs that they're running. It would be interesting to see if they challenge the students to create the labs, and I think if the educators saw what the students were capable of, it could force them to kind of grapple with some of the entrenched ideas they have about this power structure. That's one idea that's coming to mind.
Okay.
Is just if you give space for the students or an employees in a work situation to also create some of these ideas, I think we might be surprised at what they can come out with.
So it's about unlearning the practice where if you're sitting in a position of authority, you know everything. So you're a student, I'm a teacher, so I'm teaching. But so we need to unlearn that and make it a two-way, where the student is allowed to contribute ideas and challenge the tutors to consider their own thinking. And the tutors themselves need to create an environment that allows these people and even tasks them to do some things.
Yeah.
Okay. I find that quite interesting. Would you say that's one of the things that is a hallmark for an institution like MIT?
In some ways. In some ways they're still very traditional, and a lot of lectures are teacher talking, you're quickly writing all the equations down as fast as you can. But I think in general, yes, there's a feeling of students have the ability to also create and design and try new things. And I think the teachers do have a certain respect for the students' ability. So I think you're right, that does come through somewhat.
Okay, well, fantastic. So I would like us to turn our attention to something that's very dear to my heart. The future of work. A lot of what we know today as jobs will no longer be there. A lot of what's happening around us, the disruption that we're seeing, is driven by digital technology. How do we tap into that? What do you think we ought to do for young people to be very interested in these places and these spaces to the extent that they can make meaningful contributions to it?
Well, as for the interest, I don't think that's hard. I think young people are excited about technology and new things, and I think the interest is already there, or if the exposure isn't there, the interest will come as soon as the exposure comes.
Okay.
I think that So actually just yesterday, someone was showing me the World Economic Forum's report on the future of work, and I just skimmed through it, but what I gleaned from it was sort of some of the things that we already know, that to best equip students for the future, they need to be critical thinkers, they need to be creative, they need to be able to think independently. That's kind of what I was getting from that report. And so I think these foundational things that we already know are attributes to work towards are what's going to equip us for the unknown. I don't know if we need to shift everything and focus on artificial intelligence and build a curriculum around that. No, I don't think so. I think it's more about these foundational skills, giving the students a toolkit so that whatever the fourth industrial revolution brings us to, they can go for those things.
So I think it's creativity, collaboration, communication, and there was one other thing.
In that report?
In that report,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, and so really, while we're going into what we can call the unknown, we somehow feel that these values would be able to help us. How important will this be? I mean, you've experienced the Ghanaian culture for a bit, and we're on the cusp of a massive population explosion. It has a plus, and if not managed, it will be a negative as well. And I'm a perpetual optimist, and I believe that we will get something good out of this. But from what you've seen so far as education is concerned, as far as the teaching of science is concerned, how do we have to do things differently? What do we need to do differently to ensure that more and more people are benefiting from the new thinking that takes us into this new world and this revolution that, how do we give these people the toolkit they need to take that with them?
Yeah, so just building on what I said, I think these fundamental skills are things that are attainable for us to equip the young people with. And we don't need to try and figure out all the different things that are coming with the new wave of technology. I think that from what I've seen working with teachers, just a little exposure and a little space for practice goes a long way. And that's one of the things that I love about being here is I know that any small input that we're able to make is going to have a ripple effect and really impact a lot of people. So I think that I'm also optimistic like you about this. I think that with exposure and practice, we'll get there. We'll be able to build this toolkit in teachers and students.
It's good to be optimistic. I hear it's better to be pragmatic. And in being pragmatic, you have to embrace the challenges that you face. What would you say has been one of the biggest hurdles for you as you've been trying to get the vision of practical education pushed?
Okay, so one challenge is the system has a lot of parts. The bureaucracy just makes things slow. So even though we have an idea of what we want to do, there are a lot of pieces and people that have to be mobilized and aligned. So I think it's just inherently difficult to make progress in the system. Another challenge is we're often able to get teachers quite excited about what we're doing, but really what we're asking them to do is a behavior change thing, to shift how they're teaching right now, which a lot of them do initially, but then if they are the only teacher at their school that came to the program, eventually they'll get discouraged because everybody else will be looking at them and saying, why are you working more? Are you trying to show off or something? So that's another challenge, is sustaining the behavior change. Yeah.
Do you find that maybe granted that there are several different pieces that need to come together, the bureaucracy, but at the highest level of education, what has been the response to the concept, the vision of PEN?
The response has been very positive from everybody that we've interacted with, from teachers to administrators to the directors that we've been able to meet with, the response is positive. It's just, yes, everybody seems to work in their silo. So even though, for example, with the curriculum people, we've worked quite closely with them. Even in the recent revision exercise, we were invited to provide our input on the science curriculum. So we're quite close with them, but they only cover the curriculum. And so really to get a program out there, it's hard to get all the different stakeholders on board.
So if I hired you as a consultant for my hypothetical country that has similar problems, what would you first of all do in trying to blend and make sure that we break down the walls that create the silos?
One thing which would be hard, I don't know how you actually do this in practice, but is distributing power more so that power isn't all collected at the top. Right now, there's so many levels between the decision makers and the implementers. So if people in the middle had the ability to make decisions, things would move faster. And I don't think these supposed silos would really feel like silos.
I guess you answered that question earlier, because the response you just given me just takes us back to the example of the empowered student on the MIT campus that believes that in spite of tradition, I can still pitch an idea and hopefully I'll walk away with a yes, or I'd have a chance to come back and prove that this idea is worth considering. So in a nutshell, do we need power to reside in people and not necessarily in the titles, that people can interact and have the hierarchy, but in actual practice of daily work, that it should be as flat as possible?
Something towards that.
Would you compare that to the culture on the Ashesi campus, for example? Of course, there's the president, and there's faculty, and then there's students.
Yeah.
How does it feel like from the lowest of the pyramid to the top? How fast do things go up and down?
Yeah, I've been pretty impressed with how things run at Ashesi. So there is a hierarchy, as you just mentioned. There are some divisions like that. But in general, I think the students can go talk to the president anytime. If they can find time on his calendar, they're welcome to bring up any issues with him directly. Being at Ashesi, we were told as faculty that students should call us by our first name. We shouldn't force any doctor titles on them or whatever. And so that also has created this sense of sort of camaraderie, or at least comfort in engaging between the levels you just described. And I think that also extends, we faculty feel if we bring an issue to the administration, they will also listen and at least try to do something about it. So I think you're right that Ashesi has also made good progress in that line of creating more flow between the levels.
Because it seems that, as you remarked earlier, the bureaucracies create inertia, and the world is moving. No one's going to wait for you. So if you want to get ahead, then speed is probably going to be a very key part of your story and your journey. So anything that can slow it down. A lot of talk about girl child education, and the enrollment numbers have gone up, but there's also girls in technology and engineering. Do you feel that there's a need to specifically go out and look for females, and recruit females and encourage them to get into the sciences?
Yeah, the numbers are not good. If we purely look at the numbers perspective, there's very few females in STEM, especially here in Africa. So just even from the numbers alone, that tells us that there's work to be done, because inherently a more balanced distribution is going to create a more rich ecosystem. I think also when I've had the opportunity to engage with the first year engineering students at Ashesi through 2 classes now, and listening to them, I've also realized the depth in which some of these stereotypes really prohibit progress, more so than I appreciated before. There's just a lot of, barriers and stereotypes and people telling you you can't do it that students, female students, are experiencing as they grow up. And so to me, it means that there's a lot of work to be done to balance things.
What's your experience in other cultures when it comes to females and in science?
I think it's a global problem. I remember when I went to Germany, I was staying with a host family, and I was doing a study abroad at a university there, and I was excited to practice my German and tell my host mom. She was asking me, "Oh, what are you studying?" I was so excited to tell her I was studying mechanical engineering. I said Maschinenbau in German. She was like, "No, you learned the wrong vocabulary word. Like, there's no way you're studying mechanical engineering." She just assumed I had learned the wrong word in German. So it's a global issue that we don't expect women to be successful in STEM. So it's certainly not an Africa-specific issue.
Okay, and so of course, coming across these stereotypes, you would also hopefully have observed how the narrative has changed. What are some of the things that has been done elsewhere to encourage more and more females to go into STEM?
Yeah, I think research shows that role models are quite important. If you don't see somebody who looks somewhat like you, it's hard to imagine yourself in that role. Like for me, when I was doing my first degree, all of my professors were older white men, all of them. And at that time, I didn't really think about it. But if I reflect now, I realize, okay, I never thought I would be one of them, even though now I am arguably doing the same thing that they're doing. At that time, it wasn't even an option on my radar, probably because I hadn't seen anyone who looked remotely like me in that role. So that's one thing I see people in the US, for example, trying to push for now is, deliberately putting role models in front of young girls to help them.
Wow. So there's a lot of power in example. If we succeed in getting more and more female participation in STEM, and of course with the help of practicalizing teaching, the cultural context that we find ourselves in may need some rejigging or rethink, especially about the place of the woman in society. Quite often people would say, you desire to be successful at a cost, and that cost being that you probably never get married, or where do we find that balance right from the beginning so that we don't disenfranchise society of women who can live a full life?
That's a tough question. I don't know that I know the answer to that. I don't know that I know the answer to that, but I'm an action-oriented person, and so I think my initial thought is like, let's just let girls do this, and then when they show people that they're successful, these mindsets and these attitudes will necessarily start to shift. I don't know how we convince society as a whole about gender equality across all these dimensions, but I think if we start to see girls succeeding in these areas, it will force us to rethink.
The role of role models and mentors, your own personal experience, how has that shaped your journey?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to have a few mentors, at various points in my life, assisting me with various, whatever was sort of a priority at that time. And yeah, I think it's been helpful. Most of them have been females, which wasn't necessarily something I sought out directly, but I think has helped, me sort of relate more directly with them. I've been fortunate to have a couple of mentors here. Lucy Quist has been an advisor/mentor for a few years for me, and she's a strong STEM advocate, and just someone I admire for her integrity and everything. And so having someone like that, pushes you to be your best as well.
Okay, so we need to make sure that we build a bridge into the future, so to speak, that you hand off what you've learned, live by example, and reach out to people so you can give them the belief they need to see that, someone like me has done it, and so I can too.
Mm-hmm.
Good. We're going to take our final break, and when we come back, we'll bring you more on the Executive Lounge with my guest, Heather Beem. She's a lecturer at UCSC, but she's founder of the Practical Education Network, where they teach teachers how to practicalize and make the learning of science fun and memorable. Stay tuned. You're welcome back. This is the Executive Lounge with me in Sharada, with my guest Heather Beem. And we've been learning quite a lot about her journey, and which has led her to start an NGO right here in Ghana, teaching teachers how to teach science and make it fun and memorable. I hope I got that right.
Yeah.
Yeah? All right. So what's the journey been like? I know you've had your ups and downs, things are slow, but you've trained 3,000 teachers already. How was it like bringing them together, and how do you recruit the teachers? How do you reach out to people and get them interested in what you do to show up and learn?
We are ever ready to do our training for whoever has the audience. So we've worked through GES, we've worked through private schools, we've worked through local NGOs. Anybody who has an active audience with teachers, we approach them and offer to, provide STEM support for them. Mm-hmm. And it's been an exciting journey. I wouldn't have imagined that I would be living in Ghana for several years if you had asked me this, 10 years ago.
Right.
But I've really grown a lot. I've learned a lot about myself and about how to live with different priorities. And so it's been a fun journey.
Wow. Now, when you recruit the teachers, what kind of process do you have to measure the impact of what you do? Yeah,
so we actually were just able to wrap up a 1-year research study, because we get asked this question a lot. It seems like, yes, if we're doing practical stuff, it should help, but what is the actual evidence of that? Mm-hmm. So after a couple of years of preparation, we were able to do a 1-year study with 6 different schools in Greater Accra, one in Kofikwe, a rural setting, mm-hmm. one in Ofankor, and one in Kwabenya, or one pair in each of those locations. Mm-hmm. And so for the course of the year, we had a pen trainer train the science teacher in that school mm-hmm. on one of our activities. So every week, the students in that school were doing one of these simple activities with low-cost materials. Mm-hmm. And then we compared how the students performed in those schools with a neighboring school just next to it. Mm-hmm. So we measured at the beginning of the school year and at the end of the school year a few different things. What do they think about science? Do they see it as an interesting career path for them? And what were their exam scores? So we took old BEC questions and administered them. And what we found was really strong evidence for how this type of approach is impacting students. Mm-hmm. So in terms of exam scores, thankfully, all the students improved their exam scores at least somewhat over the course of the year. So thankfully, they were at least learning something in the school. But the students who were doing the pen practicals improved their scores 97% more than the students who were in the control schools. And that reflected in the actual BEC scores as well. So significant improvement in the exam scores just from doing this very low-cost intervention. And then the most striking thing was, for me, was their attitudes towards science. So the students who were doing the pen practicals, their attitudes improved across all 7 questions that we asked related to how they think about themselves, the career, and everything. The students in the control schools, their attitudes decreased for almost all the 7 questions we asked. So just by sitting in the classroom in the normal mode of chew and pour, like their attitude is decreasing significantly. And these were Form 3 JHS students. They're about to choose what they want to study in SHS. So you can imagine, we're deceiving ourselves if we think that we're just moving along with the status quo. It's actually getting worse for the students. They're losing interest very quickly. And so it's at least good to know that if we have this type of intervention, it can make a difference.
Well, it's a very interesting point you raised, that the model, the chew-pour model, is not working very well. Do you find that more stressful, and perhaps the practical approach makes it more fun, so people tend to look forward to want to do this?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Is it's more fun and interesting. And when the interest is there, it's so much easier to learn. If someone's forcing you to learn piano but you're not actually interested, it's really hard to learn. So I think that's a big piece, is the practicals just make it interesting, and therefore the learning comes.
The place of music in education, I know you talked about that, you mentioned the piano. I think you play the violin, right?
I do,
Yeah. What's the place of teaching music and helping along with education?
Wow. That's not a question I get asked very often here, but I think you're right. I was fortunate I got to learn piano and violin from a young age. At that time, I didn't really appreciate what I was doing, but I wish I knew the science behind it, but I definitely felt like I was learning in different ways when I was learning music than I was in school. And I actually loved playing music. I still love playing music as a creative outlet, or when I'm frustrated or something. So I wish I knew the science behind it, but I do know from experience there's value there from an educational perspective in just sort of getting your brain to work in a different way.
Well, guess what? You don't always have to know everything. It's just enough to light a fuse is all we need on this show. But all too soon, we're at the end of our conversation. And there are 5 things I'm taking away from this conversation. Number 1 is that you must allow the curiosity that gnaws at your self-conscious to continue, because inherent in that, you will find an outlet to make positive change. Heather kept thinking about how different could education be. Not actively, it was there somewhere, just knowing. And then, hey presto, she gets into the D lab and realizes that this could be taken to a whole new level. So don't discard that little thought that's in your mind that's asking you, could this be better than it is? How can we make things better? You're onto something. Number 2 is the power of collaboration. So she set out and worked with a whole bunch of different students, some undergrad, some graduate students, and they made a case to have education as part of the courses that was being taught in the D lab. And so don't stop collaborating with people, and they're all not going to come from the same level as you or ahead of you. You may have to sometimes collaborate with a 5-year-old because they may have something that you didn't have. Collaboration is a powerful thing. The third thing I'm taking from this is also that in spite of where we come from, stereotypes are real. But they're only temporary barriers if you let them. She studied in Germany, she studied in Taiwan, but the world over, people still think that women shouldn't or can't do certain things. Didn't stop her, and it shouldn't stop you. Wherever you find yourself, whatever the stereotype is, don't let that become the barrier that keeps you where you are. The world is your oyster, and you can do so much more with yourself. The 4th thing I'm taking away from our conversation today is that passion, and I always say this, the passion will take you places. Heather's eyes lit up every time she talked about the practical education that the program delivers to teachers and the impact that she's seeing. After 3,000 teachers trained, who knows what could happen next. There's a whole lot more, just because it's driven by a desire deep down inside her to see positive change. And the final thing I'm taking from this is the appreciation of nature. And I think that you mentioned earlier in our conversation that as a child you were able to go around and look under rocks and just basically immerse yourself in your environment. And that inspired you to keep asking more questions. I think that our appreciation of the things around us would show that certain things that we think are junk actually hold the key to the next breakthrough that we may be looking for. So, thank you, Heather, for making time to join us on the show.
Thank you as well.
And thanks to our friends at Villa Monticello and the entire production crew. And thank you for watching. We'll be back with more of the Executive Lounge where we showcase the best minds. I'm Inshirado. As always, go forward, make rain, shalom. Is this something you learned when you were born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity.
Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Inshirado.